we are back with Overanalyzing House of the Dragon, our deep dive into Fire and Blood. So last time we began our discussion of how the Dance of the Dragons started. The dance is the Blacks versus the Greens, Rhaenyra and the Velaryons versus Aegon II and the Hightowers. And the split really began under the reign of Jaehaerys, Viserys' grandfather. After Jaehaerys' son Aemon dies, Jaehaerys passes over Aemon's daughter Rhaenys, the queen who never was, for his own son Baelon. As the Aemon-Rhaenys line was tied to the Velaryons, we can see that the house would feel slighted. And we talked about how important it is to consider the bias of the storytellers, the Maesters and the Septons, who may favor who will become the Green Hightower side. So last time, Prince Aemon had just died mysteriously in war, and his allies, the Baratheons and Velaryons, were wrapped up on Tarth. Baelon, on Dragonback, goes to war and returns, almost certainly ahead of the ship-bound Corlys Velaryon, the master of ships and husband to Rhaenys, the queen who never was. On his return to King's Landing, Baelon was hailed as a hero by cheering throngs and embraced by his father the king, who named him Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne. It was a popular decree. The small folk loved Baelon the Brave, and the lords of the realm saw him as his brother's obvious successor. Now this is an odd little scene. Baelon returns and is named Jaehaerys' heir, which means the decision on who would be heir was made rather hastily without the input of Corlys Velaryon. Corlys is of course the master of ships on the small council, and is the husband of Rhaenys, the queen who never was. One wonders why an heir needed to be named so quickly. Keep in mind, Aegon ruled 36 years and never named an heir. Rhaenys ruled 5 years and never declared an heir. Maegor ruled 6 years, and only in his last year of rule did he declare his niece's daughter his heir. And no one listened to him. And Jaehaerys himself went 14 years before naming his first heir of Aemon. Oh, there were heir apparents, but no formal anointing of anyone ever happened. So why the rush with Baelon? Well, it may have something to do with the fact that Corlys, the Velaryon fleet, and the Baratheon army were all stuck on Tarth. Those who might dissent were predisposed. So with the text on Baelon's return in Fire and Blood, we also get this little picture of Baelon greeting his father Jaehaerys, with presumably the small folk looking on with joy. Happy days it appears. Except this directly contradicts what Gildain had previously written. Baelon returned, still in mourning, in tears according to the previous account. His mother as well, Queen Alysanne, was also in mourning. It's only been a matter of days since Aemon died. This was not a happy time. Sure, the small folk may have been cheering, but was that over winning a war, or was it over Baelon being named heir? And so we must wonder what Gildain is doing here. Why put the naming of Baelon as heir in the middle of a celebration by the small folk? And since when does the opinion of the small folk matter? It's also an odd statement to say that the small folk loved Baelon. Which small folk? All of them? Was there a poll or something? And it's also odd to say that the lords of the realm saw Baelon as the obvious successor. This is extremely specious. You see, generally speaking with succession in Westeros, yes, men come before women in succession, but this is only among siblings. Without sons, the daughters then become heirs, not the brothers. Now yes, succession is muddied a little bit because Aemon was never king, but his line still should inherit. For example, in Ice and Fire, the heir to the twins, Steveron Frey, dies, and he is never Lord of the Crossing. But his descendants are considered next in line, and not his brothers. Even if one puts great weight on Aemon's mere heir status and Rhaenys' sex, at most one could consider the question of succession as arguable. But it's certainly not obvious. Gildain is flat out lying here. Of course, one could argue that Targaryens, or kings in general, do not need to operate under Westerosi succession. They can perhaps choose their successors instead. For example, as late as the Mad King Aerys, we see this in practice. After Rhaegar dies, he chooses his son Viserys to be the heir over Rhaegar's children, Rhaenys and Aegon. As Daenerys is Viserys' chosen heir, it sets up a conflict between her and any of Rhaegar's children. However, at this point in our story, we have no precedent that a monarch's choice is relevant. As far as we know, Aegon did not choose Rhaenys, Rhaenys did not choose Maegor, Maegor did not choose Jaehaerys. Each transfer of power was complicated, and we'll talk about the transfers later on. The point is, Gildain is simply wrong. Not only is Baelon not the obvious choice, but choice itself is not the obvious choice. We have no precedent for any of this. Anyway, moving on. But Prince Aemon had a child. His daughter Rhaenys, born in 74 AC, had grown into a clever, capable, and beautiful young woman. In 90 AC, at the age of 16, she had wed the King's Admiral and Master of Ships, Corlys of House Velaryon, Lord of Tides, known as the Sea Snake, after the most famous of his many ships. Moreover, Princess Rhaenys was with child when her father died. By granting Dragonstone to Prince Baelon, King Jaehaerys was not only passing over Rhaenys, but also, possibly, her unborn son. So with this paragraph, we don't really get any new information. We already knew Rhaenys existed, was pregnant, and was married to Corlys Velaryon. However, I do find it interesting that Corlys is referred to as the Sea Snake often in the text. It's certainly not a compliment to be called a snake, and few want themselves known in history by a nickname. We certainly know how Jaime feels about Kingslayer. However, I will say that Gildain is not unkind to Corlys in his writings. Of course, Corlys being called the Sea Snake may not be in reference to his personality, but instead his power. The Sea Snake is his ship, and by calling Corlys this, he is always linked to his naval power, his massive, massive fleet. Keep in mind, the marriage between Rhaenys and Corlys and why it happened is actually a bit of a mystery. Rhaenys could have just as easily married her cousin Viserys, the son of Baelon, and all of these problems could have been avoided. In the year 90, when she married Corlys, she was 16 and Viserys 13. It would have worked out pretty well, but instead she married Corlys. Now we don't know what exactly the Targaryens were thinking, but we do know that Corlys was offered a different Targaryen daughter earlier, Jaehaerys' daughter Daela, and Corlys turned her down. And then he got to marry the heir to the Iron Throne's only daughter Rhaenys. That's right, Corlys turned down a Targaryen princess for the best Targaryen princess, at least in terms of succession. The Targaryens must have seen something happening with Corlys and House Velaryon's rise to power, and felt that they needed to be kept in the fold. And when I say the Targaryens saw something, I mean Rhaenys herself. The idea for Rhaenys to marry Corlys was Rhaenys's, and she convinced her father to allow it when they had been traveling. This is notable as Jaehaerys would have been away from the opinions of his advisors, Septon Barth and Grand Maester Elessar. Now, in the last sentence of the paragraph, we see the beginning of a weird argument shift. Things start moving away from Rhaenys' right to the Iron Throne to the right of Rhaenys' child. The thing is, Rhaenys being the heir is a very strong argument. It's based on Westerosi succession, while her child ruling concedes the idea that women cannot inherit the throne. It's a really bad argument, as once one makes the jump that Rhaenys is ineligible, it's not a very far leap to say that her line is ineligible. And while Gildain certainly later claims that Rhaenys herself is making this argument, I don't know why she would be doing that. Desperation after being told that women can't rule? It's either that or historians are putting words in Rhaenys' mouth. The king's decision was in accord with well-established practice. Aegon the Conqueror had been the first lord of the Seven Kingdoms, not his sister Visenya, 2 years his elder. Jaehaerys himself had followed his usurping uncle Maegor on the Iron Throne, though had the order of birth alone ruled, his sister Rhaena had a better claim. Oh boy, a well-established practice. Of all of the whoppers that Gildain has written, this is without a doubt the worst. A well-established practice. Fire and Blood has been 300-odd pages of how messy succession has been up to this point, and now Gildain has the absolute utter gall to say that there is a well-established practice. Okay, let's go through this real quick. Aegon was the first king, but he did sort of co-rule with his sisters, Rhaenys and Visenya, but whatever. He was crowned by the High Septon, and Aegon only had 2 sons, so a woman couldn't even be next, but the transfer of power was super messy anyway. Fire and Blood says that Maegor was called Prince of Dragonstone, the title later designated to heirs, though the World of Ice and Fire calls Rhaenys the Prince of Dragonstone, so perhaps there was confusion, or this is a retcon, I don't know. Whatever the case, when Aegon dies, Rhaenys is crowned by the Grand Maester, however he tells Maegor that they will co-rule, and so Maegor is made hand, and Rhaenys gives Maegor Blackfire, the sword later associated with ruling, and the gifting of which is seen as the designation of ruling. Then Rhaenys has a daughter, Dreamfire Rhaena, and people immediately start wondering if she's actually the heir, and so Maegor wants to marry her, but he's denied. Rhaenys has a son, Aegon the Uncrowned, who does marry Rhaena, and is named Prince of Dragonstone, but this is because Maegor was exiled at the time, not to mention Aegon the Uncrowned being Prince of Dragonstone happens in the World of Ice and Fire, so it may be retconned. So when Rhaenys dies, Maegor returns and is crowned by by Visenya and then kills Aegon the Uncrowned, he then forces Dreamfire Rhaena to marry him and declares Rhaena's daughter, Arya, his heir. Eventually, Rhaena and Arya escape and steal Blackfyre, Maegor dies, and there's discussion of whether Dreamfire Rhaena or Jaehaerys should be ruler. Rhaegar Baratheon pushes for Jaehaerys to be king as he gets to be Hand, and also Blackfyre inexplicably ends up in Jaehaerys' possession. And so the High Septon crowns Jaehaerys. Dreamfire Rhaena then spends years in the West trying to garner support and is called the Queen in the West. She never succeeds, but Rhaegar Baratheon does briefly consider trying to put Dreamfire Rhaena's daughter Arya on the throne. Arya is Jaehaerys' heir apparent until she disappears across the Narrow Sea. And then in 62, Jaehaerys formally makes his son Aemon Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne. So no, there was no well-established practice on succession, with regard to sex or otherwise. Who is next in line is uncertain, and it remains uncertain going into the Dance of the Dragons and well beyond. In fact, in the Time of Ice and Fire, it remains uncertain. What's also disingenuous about Gildain's statements is that he brings up Aegon the Conqueror's claim over Visenya and Jaehaerys' claim over Dreamfire Rhaena, which not only are completely different situations politically, but involve siblings. Visenya and Aegon were sister and brother. Dreamfire Rhaena and Jaehaerys were sister and brother. Everyone accepts that male siblings come before female siblings in Westerosi succession. The Dornish are not yet part of the Seven Kingdoms. But Rhaenys, the Queen Who Never Was, and Baelon are niece and uncle. She is the daughter of the elder son. She is the heir according to Westerosi succession, and bringing up previous sibling pairings in an argument is outright dishonest. Anyway, moving on. Jaehaerys did not make his decision lightly. He is known to have discussed the matter with his small council. Undoubtedly, he consulted Septon Barth, as he did on all important matters, and the views of Grand Maester Elessar were given much weight. All were in accord. Baelon, a seasoned knight of 35, was better suited for rule than the 18-year-old Princess Rhaenys, or her unborn babe, who might or might not be a boy, where Prince Baelon had already sired 2 healthy sons, Viserys and Daemon. The love of the commons, for Baelon the Brave, was also cited. And so we get some more twisting of words from Gildain. Gildain claims that many people were consulted in coming to the decision to choose Baelon over Rhaenys. Except not really. The small council was consulted, except we know that the Master of Law, Aemon, was dead, and Corlys Velaryon, the Master of Ships, was not present. So it was just Barth, Elessar, Martin Tyrell, and Ryam Redwine. And let's remember that Martin Tyrell is a Barth crony, and Ryam Redwine's house has marriage ties to the Hightowers. Everyone on the council is connected to Oldtown. Then Gildain says that on top of the small council, Jaehaerys talked to Barth and Elessar, which is a bit redundant as the small council is essentially Barth and Elessar. From what we can tell, Elessar, who is described as an opinionated man who was given much weight, is the main influencer in Jaehaerys choosing Baelon. Of course, why Jaehaerys went along with things is a mystery. The reasons given by Gildain don't make much sense. Gildain essentially says that Baelon was chosen because he was older, a knight, and would ensure patrilineal succession, and the small folk supposedly liked him. However, we should remember that Jaehaerys took the throne at 14. Rhaenys is 18, and Jaehaerys is expected to live additional years at this point. He does in fact live 11 more years. Also, knighthood shouldn't be that relevant as Jaehaerys was not a knight as far as we know, nor was his father Rhaenys or his grandfather Aegon. Maegor the Cruel was the only previous Night King, so it's a bit odd to think knighthood would hold much value for Jaehaerys. Queen Alysanne appears to believe that the issue was Rhaenys' sex, and so perhaps it was a sexist argument that swayed Jaehaerys, though this is odd as Arya Targaryen was Jaehaerys' heir for a while. And of course, being liked by the small folk is completely unprovable and irrelevant. So what was really going on? If I had to guess, I would say that Jaehaerys was trying to appease the Oldtown forces and figured which Targaryen ruler was irrelevant as long as there was a Targaryen ruler. Or he figured that Baelon was a better choice because he flew a larger dragon, Vhagar. Though, based on later actions by Jaehaerys, I do not actually think this idea is the case. With regard to the former idea, we should keep in mind that Jaehaerys did often appear to appease Oldtown. After all, a Septon was his hand, a Redwine was in charge of protecting him, and Jaehaerys had given a son to the Citadel and a daughter to the Faith, who both could be seen as hostages of sorts. The only somewhat recent decision that Jaehaerys made without the influence of the Oldtown forces, that is, the advice of Barth and Elessar, was allowing the marriage of Rhaenys and Corlys Velaryon. and this decision to pass over Rhaenys for Baelon removes the impact of that marriage. It undoes Rhaenys' meddling. But let's continue. Some dissented. Rhaenys herself was the first to raise objection. "You would rob my son of his birthright," she told the king, with a hand upon her swollen belly. Her husband, Corlys Velaryon, was so wroth he gave up his admiralty and his place on the small council, and took his wife back to Driftmark. Lady Jocelyn of House Baratheon, Rhaenys' mother, was also angered, as was her formidable brother Boromund, Lord of Storm's End. And so, as we would expect, the houses married into Aemon's line, Baratheon and Velaryon, are furious with the decision to pass over Rhaenys. Specifically, Corlys Velaryon and Boromund Baratheon are named, the very men who are stuck on Tarth with their armies and fleets, unable to act. If there is a conspiracy here, it worked pretty well. Send Aemon, Velaryon, and Baratheon off to war, and after Aemon dies mysteriously, ensure Baelon is heir while Aemon's allies are away. Now, as I've mentioned, Rhaenys fighting for her child to be the heir is rather odd. Her own claim is the strong argument, as it's in line with Westerosi succession, while the claim of her child is weak without her own claim acknowledged. Not to mention it's impractical as children cannot rule on their own. And so I do wonder if this scene with her saying, "You would rob my son of his birthright," ever happened. Not only do the words not make much sense, but Rhaenys has her hands on a swollen belly, which is really off as she just found out she was pregnant. Women usually don't have baby bumps in their first trimester, and Rhaenys leaves after Corlys Velaryon returns enraged, so she wouldn't have any opportunities to speak to Jaehaerys when she had a swollen belly. The only time when Rhaenys would be visibly pregnant and speaking with her father would perhaps be at the wedding of Viserys the following year, when Rhaenys was pregnant with her second child, if she even attended, and we have no evidence that she did. But still the argument being made is odd. She should be heir, not her baby. Now I should mention that with regard to Rhaenys' pregnancy, there was already a problem with the text that has been fixed in later editions of Fire and Blood. Specifically, Rhaenys finds out she's pregnant in the 3rd month of the year 92, which should place the birth firmly in 92 as well, but the text originally says the birth was in 93. Later editions have been corrected with the birth being in 92, but it's worth noting that our author was a little sloppy here. So who knows about that swollen belly thing? I mean, one could put together an argument that since women generally don't go around telling people that they're pregnant early on because of the high chance of miscarriage, Rhaenys was actually further along in her pregnancy, and that's why she was showing. The text was actually wrong about her finding out just before the battle on Tarth. Of course, Archmaester Elessar, being the physician at court, should know exactly when Rhaenys was pregnant and when she realized she was pregnant. This would allow him plenty of lead time to plan nefarious actions on Tarth prior to her announcing her pregnancy to others, and so perhaps he is the one obscuring things as he's Gildane's source on all of this. It's a neat little story, though again, our author was sloppy, so who knows. The most prominent dissenter was good Queen Alysanne, who had helped her husband rule the Seven Kingdoms for many years, and now saw her son's daughter being passed over because of her sex. "A ruler needs a good head and a true heart," she famously told the king. "A cock is not essential. If your grace truly believes that women lack the wit to rule, plainly you have no further need of me." And thus Queen Alysanne departed King's Landing and flew to Dragonstone on her dragon Silverwing. She and King Jaehaerys remained apart for 2 years, the period of estrangement recorded in the histories as the Second Quarrel. And so here we hear that Alysanne rightly focuses on the fact that Rhaenys is the one being passed over for the throne, which again highlights how odd it would be for Rhaenys to argue for instead her child. And Rhaenys being passed over is the cause of the Second Quarrel, which again goes against Gildane's claim that Baelon was some sort of obvious successor. Now in this section of the text it's glossed over, but in an earlier chapter we find out that Jaehaerys never recovers from the events of 92. The death of Aemon, along with Alysanne and Rhaenys leaving him, break Jaehaerys emotionally, and he is reportedly never happy again, despite Alysanne later returning. He is given honeyed wine every night to go to sleep, and we should remember that the maesters cover their medicine with honey. The old king and good queen were again reconciled in 94 AC by the good offices of their daughter, Septa Miguel, but never reached accord on the succession. The queen died of a wasting illness in 100 AC, at the age of 4 and 60, still insisting that her granddaughter Rhaenys and her children had been unfairly cheated of their rights. The boy in the belly, the unborn child who had been the subject of so much debate, proved to be a girl when born in 93 AC. Her mother named her Laena. The next year, Rhaenys gave her a brother, Laenor. Prince Baelon was firmly ensconced as heir apparent by then, yet House Velaryon and House Baratheon clung to the belief that young Laenor had a better claim to the Iron Throne, and some few even argued for the rights of his elder sister Laena and their mother Rhaenys. So here we hear about a reconciliation between Jaehaerys and Alysanne, which is not much of a reconciliation in actuality. They never came to an agreement, and in the previous chapter we find out that both Jaehaerys and Alysanne's physical and mental health begin to go at this point. Jaehaerys and Alysanne were 58 and 56 respectively in the year 92, so it's a little suspicious. While Jaehaerys wallows in depression, Alysanne is getting injured and apparently cannot understand what's going on at the small council meetings. Alysanne's daughter Gael is said to be her only companion, so it sounds like Alysanne and Jaehaerys were not talking at all. And after Gael dies, Alysanne leaves Jaehaerys again in 99 and dies in 100. It is notable that Alysanne dies of a wasting sickness, which evokes Dany's guardian Sir Willem Darry, but also Jon Arryn, who died wasting away from poison, speaking of succession and genetics. So Jaehaerys and Alysanne being a happy couple with a pair of brief meaningless quarrels is a ridiculous notion, as they spend their final 13 years either arguing or barely speaking to each other. And it appears the second quarrel never really ended, as we hear Alysanne complaining about the passing over of Rhaenys all the way until her death. And she wasn't the only one. House Velaryon and House Baratheon were complaining as well. And still Gyldain claims that Baelon as heir was firmly settled. Now, Gyldain is a bit Weasley with his words and trying to downplay Rhaenys' claim, again moving the discussion to the children rather than Rhaenys herself. But he gives away the game in a few places. Gyldain tells us that Rhaenys' first child was a girl, born in 93 and not a boy. As I said in later editions of Fire and Blood, this is corrected to 92. Now, Gyldain is trying to undermine Rhaenys' argument, but he accidentally reveals that, yes, there was a big argument back in 92. Previously, he claimed that Baelon was the obvious choice among lords, and the small council was all in agreement, and the small folk were happy about it. So, besides Rhaenys and Alysanne being angry and leaving immediately, what debate was there? Again, Baelon was supposedly the obvious choice, based on a well-established practice. But now Gyldain lets it slip that there was in fact much debate. Jaehaerys' decision to pass over Rhaenys did in fact cause disagreements, which would make sense as it was clearly against Westerosi succession and would shake the feudal status quo. But still, despite admitting that there was conflict, Gyldain insists on trying to belittle Rhaenys' claim by coupling it with a hypothetical claim of Rhaenys' daughter Laena. Now there is very little logic that would make Laena the heir. If one accepts that women can inherit, Rhaenys is the heir. If one accepts that Aemon's line inherits, but women cannot rule, Laenor is the heir. The only way to exclude Rhaenys and get to Laena is to have Rhaenys specifically disinherited and to believe that a daughter can come before a son in the line of succession, which outside of Dorne no one believes. Gyldain is intentionally putting the strongest claimant, Rhaenys, with a comically weak claimant, Laena, in order to try to make Rhaenys' claim appear weak. And his bias makes one seriously question whether only a few argued for Rhaenys' claim. And we will continue with the 9 years of Baelon as heir in part 3. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.